All right, so get this. You've been looking into cybersecurity in Linux lately, and we've got a story that's going to make you rethink how secure those systems really are.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about something called the XZ Backdoor. It sounds like, I don't know, something straight out of a spy movie. But this thing had the potential to, like, disrupt a huge chunk of the internet. Thankfully, disaster was averted, but it was a close call. So, expert speaker, can you give us the rundown on just how big of a deal this XZ Backdoor could have been?
Well, think of it this way. Linux powers a lot of the internet, from the servers that host your favorite websites to critical infrastructure like power grids and banking systems. And XZ is a tool that's used for compressing data in the Linux world. And it's also used on Mac OS, by the way. It's kind of like zipping up a file to make it smaller and easier to send around. But here's a kicker. A lot of crucial programs, like SSH, which lets you securely connect to servers remotely, rely on XZ. So now imagine someone getting control of that compression tool and using it to sneak malicious code onto millions of servers. They could potentially, they could have the keys to the kingdom, right? Gaining what's called root access, the highest level of permission on a system.
So not just some minor glitch then.
Not at all. If this attack had been successful, it could have had a ripple effect across the internet, potentially disrupting, like essential services and causing widespread chaos.
Okay, so we're talking about a really high-stakes situation here. But, I mean, who would even attempt something like this, and how did they manage to pull it off?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. This wasn't like some random hacker trying their luck. The attacker, who went by the name Jia Tan, spent years infiltrating the open source community. They earned everyone's trust by contributing helpful code and becoming, like a respected member of the group.
Yeah.
It was a classic case of social engineering gaining people's confidence to manipulate them for malicious purposes.
Wow, so they were playing the long game, sneaking in under the radar. But even if people trusted them, wouldn't someone have noticed the malicious code? Isn't open source software all about transparency?
You'd think so, right? But the attacker was incredibly clever. They hid the malicious code in test files, which are parts of the code that most people wouldn't think to, scrutinize. And the code was designed to only activate during the build process when the software is being compiled from source code into, a working program.
So even if someone was reviewing the source code, they wouldn't see the backdoor just sitting there.
Exactly. It was like a ticking time bomb, waiting to be triggered at just the right moment.
And how was it triggered?
By a specific SSH key. Think of it like a secret knock that only the attacker knew. This meant that even if someone stumbled across the malicious code, they wouldn't be able to activate it. The backdoor was designed to only respond to the attacker's command.
I'm starting to see how this was a really stealthy operation. But how on earth was this backdoor ever discovered if it was so well hidden?
Well, this is where we introduce a bit of luck into the equation. A Microsoft engineer named Andre Freund discovered the backdoor completely by accident.
Wait, Microsoft? I thought this was all about Linux.
It is, but Freund was doing some performance testing on a Debian system, which is a type of Linux distribution. He noticed that SSH logins were taking a fraction of a second longer than usual, a tiny detail that most people would have missed.
So this guy must have some seriously sharp eyes.
He does, and his attention to detail, coupled with the fact that he was using an unstable version of Debian and doing, very precise performance measurements, made him the perfect person to catch this attack.
It's almost unbelievable that such a tiny anomaly could have such huge implications. What would happen if he hadn't noticed?
If Freund hadn't caught it, the backdoor could have made its way into the stable releases of major Linux distributions, potentially giving the attacker access to countless systems worldwide.
Okay, so this was a really close call. But we still don't know who this Jia Tan really is. Were they just some lone wolf hacker? Or is there something more to this story?
That's the question everyone's been asking. And the answer is, we still don't know for sure. But there are some clues that point to a much bigger and more unsettling possibility. The attacker's online activity seems to have been meticulously scrubbed, almost like they were trying to erase their digital footprint. This level of operational security, or OPSCC for short, is not something you typically see with amateur hackers. It suggests a level of training and sophistication that points towards a more organized operation.
So maybe not just a lone wolf then?
Potentially not. And there's another piece of the puzzle that has investigators scratching their heads: the timestamps of the attacker's activity.
Timestamps? You mean like when they were making changes to the code?
Exactly. By analyzing when and where the attacker was active, investigators can start to piece together a picture of their movements and potentially even their location.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How do you track someone down using timestamps? It's not like they're leaving their home address in the code.
Not their address, no. But each timestamp includes information about the time zone the computer was set to when the changes were made. Remember how I mentioned UTC earlier? It stands for Coordinated Universal Time, and it's the primary time standard used worldwide. Every time zone is offset from UTC by a certain number of hours.
Right, like how we're in Eastern time, which is UTC minus 5 hours. So if I understand correctly, by looking at the time zone information in the timestamps, investigators can get an idea of where the attacker might be located.
Precisely. It's like having, like a digital trail of breadcrumbs. And in this case, the breadcrumbs led investigators to a very interesting pattern. The vast majority of the attacker's commits, the changes they made to the code, were made during what would be normal working hours in the UTC plus 8 time zone.
Okay, so UTC plus 8, that covers a pretty big chunk of the world, right?
It does, parts of China, Russia, Australia. But here's where things get really interesting. A handful of commits were made during working hours in the UTC plus 2 and UTC plus 3 time zones.
Hold on, so the attacker was somehow like jumping between time zones while they were working on this backdoor? Is that even possible?
It's highly unlikely that someone could physically travel between those time zones in the short intervals between these commits.
Okay, so what's the explanation then? Did our super spy hacker make a sloppy mistake and forget to adjust their clock?
That's one possibility. Even the most careful individuals can make mistakes. But there's another possibility that investigators are considering. VPNs.
VPNs, like the things people use to protect their privacy online.
Exactly. VPNs, or virtual private networks, allow you to route your internet traffic through a server in a different location, effectively masking your true IP address and making it appear as though you're browsing from somewhere else. It's possible that the attacker was using a VPN to further obfuscate their location, and perhaps they accidentally connected to servers in those other time zones, leaving behind those telltale timestamps.
So it could have been a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators or just a careless slip-up.
Either way, those timestamps have become a crucial piece of the puzzle in trying to determine who was really behind this attack. And there's another intriguing detail that has emerged. The attacker actually made some commits during Chinese holidays.
Really? That seems like an odd move for someone trying to blend in, especially if they were, say, a Chinese government operative.
You'd think so, right? It's much more likely that someone trying to disguise their identity would, meticulously avoid working during holidays associated with their alleged location.
So those holiday timestamps seem to cast doubt on the idea that this was the work of a Chinese government-backed hacker. But if not China, then who?
Well, those UTC plus 2 and UTC plus 3 time zones, combined with the holiday slip-up, have led some researchers to believe that the attacker could be based in Eastern Europe, potentially even Russia.
Russia. That name seems to be popping up a lot in this story. Is there any specific evidence to support that theory?
It's all circumstantial at this point, but there are some intriguing parallels to other cyber attacks that have been linked to Russia. Remember those operational security skills we talked about earlier? The attacker's ability to cover their tracks and operate undetected for years.
Yeah, it's starting to sound familiar.
Well, these are all hallmarks of a type of cyber attack known as an advanced persistent threat, or APT for short. APT groups are highly skilled, often state-sponsored hacking groups that engage in long-term targeted attacks against specific organizations or individuals.
So this isn't just some kid in their basement messing around. We're talking about professional cyber spies.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And Russia's had been linked to several high-profile APT groups, some of which have been operating for decades.
Okay, so now we've got a mystery attacker who spent years infiltrating a trusted community, planted a sophisticated backdoor that could have had devastating consequences, and might be connected to a Russian APT group. It's a lot to take in. Where do we even go from here?
I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that we can't afford to be complacent about cybersecurity. The threats are evolving constantly, and even the systems we think are secure can be vulnerable.
It feels like we've stumbled onto, a real-life spy thriller here, but let's try to make sense of all of this. If this attack was so sophisticated, why not just, hack directly into those systems? Why go through this whole elaborate scheme of planting a backdoor in a compression tool?
That's a great question, and it really highlights what makes supply chain attacks so dangerous. By compromising a widely used tool like XZ, the attacker could potentially infect countless systems without having to, like directly attack each one individually.
So it's less about breaking down the front door and more about poisoning the well.
Exactly. And it makes these attacks incredibly difficult to defend against, because you're not just protecting your own systems, you're relying on the security of every piece of software in your supply chain.
Okay, so this deep dive has given us a pretty intense look at the world of cybersecurity. We've got a mystery attacker, potentially with ties to a foreign government, a hidden backdoor, and a near miss that could have had catastrophic consequences. Where do we even go from here? What are the key takeaways from this whole XZ backdoor saga?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't take cybersecurity for granted. The threats are constantly evolving, and even the systems we think are secure can be vulnerable.
So a healthy dose of paranoia is a good thing when it comes to cybersecurity.
Absolutely, but paranoia without action is pointless. We need to be proactive about security. That means keeping our systems up to date, being cautious about the software we use, and educating ourselves about the latest threats.
Okay, so those are the practical steps, but I'm also wondering about, the bigger picture. How do we prevent something like this from happening again? Do we need to rethink the way open source software is developed and maintained?
That's a complex issue. Open source software is incredibly valuable. It drives innovation and allows for collaboration on a global scale. But we need to find ways to make it more resilient to these kinds of attacks.
So it's not about abandoning open source. It's about strengthening it.
Exactly. There are several initiatives underway to improve the security of open source software. Things like better code auditing tools, increased funding for maintainers, and improved collaboration between open source projects and security researchers.
That's encouraging to hear. But while those solutions are being developed, what can we do as individuals? We're not all cybersecurity experts, but we rely on these systems every day.
You're right. We all have a role to play. We can start by being more aware of the risks, questioning our assumptions about security, and staying informed about the latest threats.
So stay vigilant, stay informed, and maybe invest in a really good antivirus program.
Exactly. And remember, cybersecurity is a team effort. We need to work together, share information, and support the developers and researchers who are working tirelessly to keep our digital world safe.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. Thanks for walking us through this wild story and breaking down what it all means. The XZ backdoor is a stark reminder that even the most trusted systems can be vulnerable.
It's definitely a wake-up call for all of us.
So for you listening, we'll leave you with this. What steps can you take to improve your own digital security? It's a question worth pondering, especially given how reliant we've all become on these complex, interconnected systems. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.